I'm really excited to welcome you all to this virtual event. It's great to see every single one of you in this Zoom room. I'm Lauren Zinn, the Director of Development for IHAA, and my colleagues who are here tonight include our Executive Director, Bruce Martin, our Program Director, Janelle Fossler, and our IT guy, John Martin, who are helping to deliver this program. I want to also say that I'm personally grateful that all of you have logged in and are sharing your precious time to attend this event to learn about healing social strife through cultural intelligence with Steve McIntosh, who I'll introduce in a moment. I just want to welcome you to IHAA, International House Ann Arbor. This is a place. It's actually a physical building with apartments and common spaces. It's a place where students and scholars who are reside here. And now you, the public who reside anywhere, can join us and learn both inside and outside our walls. So we're located next to the University of Michigan campus, but we're separate from U of M, though we work very closely with many university departments. And the students and scholars who live here, just so you know, they come from all over the world, including the United States, to participate in IHAA's program of global engagement for understanding. And this program entails living, learning, and leading together. And through the living experience of this program, our residents have multiple opportunities to experience life in the US and life as a mini global community. Again, this is an intentionally diverse group of students and scholars from all over, and they leave with a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. They leave with lifelong friendships, intercultural respect, expanded worldviews, and a strong sense of community. They also learn about each other's cultures in the process. That includes communal, spiritual, political, values-based aspects through direct engagement through our events. And they also develop leadership skills when they share their cultures with local school children, raising global awareness and understanding of other cultures. So some of our GEU events are for residents only, and some, like tonight, are open to the public. So again, if you just joined us, welcome. Now, all of this living, learning, and leading that happens at IHAA has an impact. When our residents become alumni, and just so you know, we're a 135-year-old nonprofit, so we have alumni all over the world, they carry their experience of global engagement for understanding into the world, into other communities where they interact with many people. And slowly their experience and continuous engagement makes a difference, positively improving cultural understanding and evolving our world's development. Which brings me to Steve McIntosh and his body of work. So my introduction of Steve will be a little personal, so please keep up for another minute. If you know me, it won't be a surprise that you would learn that I've attended a lot of interfaith, interspiritual conferences. One conference was called the Big I, where I stood for interfaith, interspiritual, and integral, referring to integral philosophy. And at this conference, I was trying to find some good material to read about integral philosophy, and someone suggested you really ought to read this book called Integral Consciousness by Steve McIntosh. I actually have that book here with me. So here's Integral Consciousness. And that was the first book of Steve's that I read. From there, it made so much sense to me. I read Evolution's Purpose and The Presence of the Infinite. And every now and then I would wander over to Steve's website, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, where he is president, just to see what he had to say, especially after the 2016 election. And a few months ago, when I was feeling particularly despondent about politics in this country, especially after listening to the news, I thought, what can I read that will inspire me, that might explain what is really going on and might even offer some solutions? And Steve just popped into my head. So I went to his website, and there I discovered that he had just published a new book. And lo and behold, the title is Developmental Politics: How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself. I mean, I couldn't have asked for, a more direct answer to those thoughts. So Steve is not only a philosopher of politics and culture, but a successful lawyer from the University of Virginia, a successful businessman from University of Southern California. And he also co-authored Conscious Leadership, Elevating Humanity Through Business with the CEO of Whole Foods, John Mackey, and with Carter Phipps. His innovative political thinking has been featured by various media outlets, including NPR and USA Today and more. And he lives in Boulder, and you can learn more about him at stevemcintosh.com. So, given that IHAA is about deepening cultural understanding in the most practical way by engaging directly with people from globally diverse cultural, spiritual, and national backgrounds, by creating opportunities for individual personal growth, my colleagues and I are proud to welcome Steve as part of our program in Global Engagement for Understanding. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments after Steve presents. So please, let's welcome Steve McIntosh. And Steve, thank you so much for being here and joining us from Boulder.
Thanks very much, Lauren, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone here who's joined the call. Really appreciate your interest in this subject, which might be framed as a hyperpolarization, right? Or the torn social fabric of American society and how that's impacting not just politics, but practically every institution. And the approach to this that I advocate in my recent book, Developmental Politics, and through the work of the Institute for Cultural Evolution think tank, it's a novel approach. It's not a mediation approach where we're trying to meet in the middle or we're trying to just get people to get along together. I mean, that's kind of a natural impulse of people who want to address climate change, is that if we just got everybody in the same room and talking, they'd find that they had a common ground. However, it seems in the current situation that there's little common ground left. So one way of summarizing the unique approach of developmental politics is to stake out a higher ground, a kind of a new political perspective that's outside and above the left-right spectrum, and which is not identical to centrism. I personally am going to be voting for Biden, but I try to be transpartisan in my politics with the acknowledgement that there are millions of people of good faith and good sense who support Trump for reasons that progressive people have a hard time understanding. So what's wrong is not simple, and neither is our prescription, but trying to make it accessible and useful in a 45-minute presentation or less. I'm going to try to stop my remarks at about a quarter to the hour. And so I really invite you that as I'm talking, if you have questions or comments or objections or challenges or anything that come up, I would really appreciate it if you keep note of those and bring them up at the end, because I hope to have a lively discussion. Indeed, that may be the best part of our brief time together. So just a quick bit of background on this. I was drawn to integral philosophy in the year 2000, partially because since I was a little boy, was very interested in periods of cultural fluorescence or renaissance, periods in history where things seemed to move forward rapidly. I had a sense that I was somehow called to participate in such an event, and I was too young to be part of the 60s. So I had kind of missed the big cultural event of the time, and was at first very attracted to progressive culture and wanted to continue and participate in that. But discovering integral philosophy around 2000 sort of showed me that there was something that was even more progressive in a way, more inclusive than what counts as progressive politics in our time. And so I began to try to make an independent contribution to integral philosophy, which led to my first book, which published in 2007, as Lauren mentioned, that's Integral Consciousness. But then by the time that I had finished my second book in 2012, Evolution's Purpose, I realized that the most useful thing about this philosophy, it's basically a philosophy of evolution that focuses on the evolution of human culture and consciousness. How does history develop? And so I realized, myself and a variety of my colleagues, we realized that the most useful application of this philosophy was to the culture war. and issues, political issues that were impacted by the culture war was the area where this philosophy could do the most good. I mean, it also impacts spirituality and other elements of culture, but politics seemed to be the glaring problem, at least in America where I live. And so we decided that we were going to form a think tank. We had seen, for example, in 2012, how boutique think tanks had significantly reduced the consensus in American politics in favor of action on climate change. One of the most dramatic drops after Al Gore, climate change was gaining ground. And then through these funded think tanks, a lot of that opinion was called into question. And we thought if the consensus to do something about climate change can be so impacted by these boutique think tanks, maybe we can create a boutique think tank that can have an outsized influence on American politics because we have a new perspective that's not recognized by the mainstream. So we started working on the issue of climate change. But after about a year and a half focusing on climate change, we began to realize that the primary reason that climate change was stuck as an issue in American politics was that the hyperpolarization of the gridlocked politics had made it into a political football such that even though, as Thomas Friedman said, green should be the new red, white, and blue, that everyone should care about climate change, that it had been an issue that was identified by many people on the right as an issue of the left. So it became a victim of the culture war in a way. We could also see that the hyperpolarization in politics was really arising upstream from politics. It was more of a cultural problem that was impacting politics. But a lot of the reason that political scientists and political commentators have a hard time appreciating the cultural dimensions of the hyperpolarization, which has made our politics dysfunctional and which indeed threatens our democracy, was because it's hard for them to see culture. Culture is kind of a black box. They may be able to say some things about it, but the idea that we could actually be proactive in fostering and advancing the evolution of culture, that was a new idea that we were bringing to the table. And so between 2013, when we incorporated as a nonprofit, until about 2016, we worked on the issue of hyperpolarization, convening a number of high-level conclaves of influential people, writing articles and op-eds and just working on the issue. But by 2016, before the election of Donald Trump, we realized that the next step in the development of the work of the think tank was to publish a book that would be kind of a cornerstone of our philosophy, our political philosophy, our social theory, our theory of change, and our program and method for making a meaningful difference in the torn social fabric of American society. So that's a little bit of the background. I started writing the book in early 2017, and it was just published March 1st of 2020 this year. Since the book was published, my colleagues and I have gained a lot of ground. We've gotten some good funding, additional funding for the think tank. We've refined our message. We're in the process of launching a kind of a project at the end of this year after the election. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is really made for after the election, because certainly Donald Trump's presidency has exacerbated polarization, right? America's more divided than ever before. But as I argue in the book, Developmental Politics, in some ways, Trump is more of a symptom of the hyperpolarization, right? The people who sent him to political office, many of them from a cultural perspective thought that they really needed kind of a cultural bodyguard, that many of their cherished values and culture, at least the people of good sense and good faith among the millions who voted for Trump, many of them really realized that they saw a threat from progressive culture, that progressive people and many liberal Democrats who are not necessarily progressive, but practically everyone on the left has a hard time seeing. So they straw man the Trump voters as irredeemable racists or deplorables. And certainly there's bad people on both sides of the aisle. And I'm not going to defend Trump, but I will defend people of good sense and good faith who are on the right, who feel so threatened that they need to send our cultural bodyguard to disrupt the politics. That's a symptom of this larger problem of our hyperpolarized body politic. So our program begins with a perspective. It's a perspective, as I mentioned, that's kind of outside and above the left-right spectrum. And it attempts to integrate the best values, not just of the left and the right, but of America's major worldviews, which I will discuss and show a slide about in a moment. But the perspective itself is something that we invite people to adopt or try on, because from this perspective, a lot of solutions appear, a lot of ways forward are illuminated in ways that can't be seen without this perspective, right? And so it's not just a perspective, it leads to a method, it leads to this idea of cultural intelligence, which I'll also explain. But I just want to give you an overview of what we're talking about here. According to our analysis of cultural evolution, it's because of the significant cultural evolution of America over the last 50 years, at least among a segment of American society, that American culture has been stretched out such that it no longer coheres as a governable entity, right? In other words, our Constitution, the American government, is formed around checks and balances and with political compromises in mind. And so when it becomes impossible to compromise with the other side, the government stops functioning. And that leads to all kinds of other problems. But it's not just, again, it's not just a political issue, it's also a cultural issue, because the culture war is disrupting and negatively impacting almost every institution in American society at the moment. So what is this new perspective? It starts with the idea that culture can be understood more accurately, more deeply. That is, we can see into culture as a prerequisite to being able to work with culture. It's the evolution of culture that's brought us to this hyperpolarized condition. And realistically, it's only the further evolution of culture that can help us grow out of this. We have to grow. It's not a problem we can solve. It's a condition that we have to grow out of. And while there'll always be political contest, there'll always be some form of the left, some form of the right, some form of conflict between people who want to fix what's wrong and people who want to preserve what's right. That's a natural condition. And indeed, it can be a healthy condition, right? The political opposition in the United States between World War II and the late 60s was highly functional. That time in history is known as the liberal consensus. And there was a huge amount of bipartisan cooperation. But as a result of the emergence of progressivism beginning in the 60s and continuing to its current cultural ascendancy at the moment, this has disrupted that consensus for both good and bad, right? So there's no going back. We're not going to glue the pieces back together. We're not going to return to some a period of centrist compromise that existed prior to the rise of progressivism. Our proposed solution is that we grow in a way that brings forward and advances many of the important values and goals of progressivism, but does so in a way that can better include and become sympathetic to the other forms of culture which progressivism, at least many voices in progressivism, currently reject and vilify. So again, it's not simply centrism, even though some of the solutions can look a little bit like that. It's exactly not that. It's something. We're not looking for common ground. We're trying to stake out higher ground. So let's go to the first slide. Janelle, if you could put that up on the screen. Okay, so this is a graphic from the book. I'll just dwell on it for a moment because it gives a vivid picture of what I'm talking about. So if we look at politics, there's a sort of topography, or we can compare it to geology, to the stratigraphy or stratified layers of geography. And when we look at politics, the surface is what elected officials are doing. The level below that is political parties. The level below that are specific political issues and specific political interests that people and the political parties are debating and vying over. But underneath all of those layers of politics is what I call bedrock values. These are the identity providing, progress defining horizons of improvement, and indeed horizons of a higher purpose and transcendence that really serve as the bedrock for the major blocks of American culture. And so in order to understand American culture, it's very important to look at the level of values, look below the surface of these other political manifestations, because that's where we can begin to apply a method of integration that can help us grow beyond the current conflict. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're talking about culture, and we're talking about a perspective that is described as a developmental perspective, a perspective that sees how culture has changed and indeed how it's evolved significantly, really over the last 350 years, but most profoundly in the last 50 years. And so the concept that helps us see this development most explicitly is the idea of worldviews. And I define a worldview as an intergenerational cultural set of agreements. It's a system of agreements, which many people explicitly ascribe to or identify with. But these cultural structures kind of supervene on people's minds, even though they're made up of agreements of individual people. There's a realm of culture wherein these agreements cohere and affect history. And the best way to understand these systems of agreement, which define culture and define what the good life is and how things could be made better, is to think about them in worldviews. And the two major worldviews of American politics, which are well recognized within mainstream discourse and by academia, are the worldviews of what I call traditionalists and the worldview of modernity. So to talk about it as a system of agreement, I use the term modernism or modernists, but the more accurate term is modernity. That is the world of reason and science and economic progress and globalization. We're not talking about ideologies. These worldviews contain many ideologies, some of which are highly conflicting with each other, but they do manifest kind of levels of civilization which have external objective manifestations like a first world economy or like a world religious tradition. So in America, the rough estimates of people whose general center of gravity can be associated with a worldview, right? So a typical American makes meaning using more than one of these major worldviews. But to begin to explain, consider the traditional worldview, which a good example would be evangelical Christians or Orthodox Jews, people for whom religion is primary, people for whom when there's a conflict between science and religion, they'll side with religion because that's where their heart lies, that's where their cultural identity is. And even though they may live in a modern society and use modern technology, their identity is centered around their religion. Now, not all traditionalists are necessarily religionists, but this traditional worldview currently constitutes the center of gravity for about 30% of American society, right? And so this is a worldview. And even though it's made up of different religions, the emergence and political ascendancy of modernity, right, which was this worldview that emerges with the Enlightenment, but which continues to provide the purview, even though it itself has evolved, modernity continues to cohere and continues to define the mainstream of America. So the reason that worldviews are important is we ask, what is modernity, right? It's not just the Industrial Revolution. It's not just science. It's not just an evolution of philosophy. It's not just liberal values or a modern economy. It's all of those things. But the reason that it's a worldview is that unless there's a critical mass of this worldview in a society, then many of the elements, many of the pathologies of traditionalism keep pulling that society back into a traditional center of gravity, and the benefits of modernity are hard to achieve, as we see in many parts of the developing world. However, even though the worldview of traditionalism and modernity is well recognized within many different discourses and academic disciplines, this third major worldview that's emerged right since the 60s, maturing over the decades, beginning as a kind of a counterculture, but now maturing into a kind of a counter-establishment. We have this third major worldview, which I'm labeling progressivism or progressives. Again, with a center of gravity of approximately 20%. Now, there are a lot of people who have a progressive morality, but a modernist cultural center of gravity. So it's complex. Like I said, what's wrong is not simple. But for purposes of giving you a glimpse or a taste or a basic introduction to this way of seeing, I'm simplifying these cultural structures in this developmental trajectory, with traditionalism being the oldest, right? Thousands of years old. Modernity being about 350 years old since the Enlightenment, but continuing to serve as the mainstream worldview of America. And progressivism now gaining significant ground culturally. And so this worldview is important to see. Many people, everybody can see environmentalism or wokeism or what they might call the far left. But this isn't something that can be easily explained or understood by forcing ourselves into a horizontal continuum of left and right. Because progressivism, the emergence of it, is responding to the unsustainable and negative externalities of modernity and traditionalism in ways that represent authentic evolution. However, I want to quickly add that every one of these worldviews, part of this developmental perspective, is that each one of these worldviews form a larger internal cultural ecosystem. In other words, these worldviews are interdependent. That, as I argue at length in developmental politics, modernity, its emergence and fluorescence in any society is partially dependent upon the previous accomplishments of traditionalism. Like, traditional societies, they inculcate the values of fair play and respect for rightful authority and the sacrifice of self-interest for the greater good and the family values. I mean, it's sort of a cliche to talk about it, but again, as I argue, you'll have to just accept my assertion in this context. But I argue that modernity borrows the social capital of traditionalism and ultimately is unsustainable without it, or can't even emerge without a healthy traditionalism serving as the platform of that emergence. Likewise, progressivism as a cultural structure, as it's emerging now in the developed world, also depends on the accomplishments of modernity, right? It borrows the achievements of liberal values, of freedom of speech, of cultural pluralism, of the prosperity and freedom from dire poverty, which are prerequisites for most of progressive culture to kind of take root and become a major cultural political bloc as it is today. However, beyond these historically emerging worldviews that are all still here, right? Even though traditionalism is thousands of years old, there's many millions of Americans who still have that as their cultural center of gravity. And people have a right to be who they are, right? People who are traditionalists aren't all, Nazis or bigots, right? There's ways to be a traditionalist that is highly moral, even though it may indeed be threatened by progressivism, which I'll get into. But let's move to the next slide. Okay. So here are these same categories that may be more familiar as I've aligned them along the left-right spectrum, right? Previously, I showed three worldviews evolving along a timeline, from older to newer. And here I've arranged those worldviews. Instead of 3 circles, I'm showing 4 circles. And part of the reason for that is this more accurately represents the current state of the American body politic. Some of this was recently validated through sociological research from the Hidden Tribes report, which saw some of these same categories. Also, some of the empirical evidence behind these value categories is found in the World Values Survey, which is a multi-decade survey, a sociological survey headed by Ronald Engelhardt that's part of the University of Michigan. So, okay, so just to explain what I'm showing here, we've got the left and the right. Almost all progressives side with the left. Almost all traditionalists side with the right. Like there may be some traditional religionists who are still Democrats, but as a result of the intensity of the partisanship of the culture war, most traditionalists, even though they may not like Trump or agree with many of the things that he's done, nevertheless feel a sense of cultural loyalty because they're in this intense culture war and Trump's their bodyguard, at least from their perspective. So we have traditionalism on the right, progressivism on the left, and modernity is pulled, modernity, unlike these other major worldviews, is kind of split, maybe 60-40. I'm showing it as a split down the middle, 50-50, just for graphical simplicity. But you have a significant portion of people who are modernists who are nevertheless loyal to traditional values. The traditionalism provides a moral system that they feel more comfortable with. Likewise, the people who are moderate Democrats or people who are not necessarily progressive, but who are nevertheless on the left, can be identified as liberal modernists who may not buy into all of the progressive programs or want to go as far as progressives want to go, but they're nevertheless voting Democrats who are on the left and certainly oppose Trump. So let's move to the next slide, the final slide. Okay, so this is the same graphic showing the major blocks. And part of what justifies this analysis, right? These aren't just convenient analytical categories. These are real identity providing cultural systems. And the systems themselves are evidenced by the polarities that exist between them. So the hyperpolarization, of course, can be seen from across the left-right spectrum, right? As emphasized by the Democratic and Republican parties. And that is shown by the overarching large arrow at the top. But we can also see a polarity within the left, and to a lesser degree, a polarity within the right, is shown by the second level of arrows. The polarity on the left is particularly evident as we see the difference between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So part of the reason, Bernie Sanders certainly represents the progressive worldview and progressive politics in important ways. And I'm certainly sympathetic to many of his programs. But I also am sympathetic to the larger coherence of American society and recognize that progressivism is doing a very important job in calling out the negative externalities, the unsustainable economic situation and environmental situation within modernity. But it's also led to Donald Trump. The rise of cultural power of progressivism is part of what's causing the culture war. Not that I blame them for being progressives or for advancing progressive causes, right? I'm sympathetic in some ways to all of these political positions. But the method of cultural intelligence, which is sort of the cornerstone of this method of this new political perspective, which we're advocating, is a way of understanding each of these political major blocks. Each one has positive values and negative pathologies. So the method of cultural intelligence involves seeing the upside and the downside of progressivism, the upside and the downside of both the left wing and the right wing of modernity, and even the upside and downside of traditionalism. And part of the way these see the upside, so let me just give you some examples, right? So progressive values, positives of progressive include making the environment a priority, not being satisfied with the status quo and calling for greater social justice, calling for the equality of the sexes and the liberation of LGBTQ people. So I could go on. In the book, I have a list of all of the at least some of the positive values of progressivism, which I argue our society needs and which makes us a more caring and loving world. Traditionalism also, I mentioned, it has extremely positive values like sacrifice of self-interest for the greater good, fair play. Now, progressives and traditionals don't always live up to their values, and they each have negatives, which I'll mention in a moment. But the values of modernity, I label these in the book as liberty values and caring values. So under the blue liberal modernists, they're what I call fairness values. That is not maybe as extreme or radical as progressivism's demands, but liberal modernists ever since Bill Clinton and before have been calling for greater social justice. And we might argue about whether Clinton was too centrist or not, but not to get lost in the weeds. It's very important to see that the conservative modernists, they have a set of values that we need too. And these values are centered around the key cultural innovation that makes modernity so powerful materially, economically, socially. And that is these liberal values. I don't just mean liberal in the democratic sense. I mean liberal in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, due process, economic freedom. All of the freedoms that are enshrined in the US Constitution are values that can't be taken for granted. That is, if we don't preserve our liberties, then the entire system is likely to collapse back into a pre-modern traditional condition, as some evidence we've seen in history. When modernity doesn't take root, when you have the technologies of modernism without the liberal values of modernism, you get pseudo-modernism that turns into Nazism or communism or some other totalitarian system, because it's those liberal values that keep totalitarianism at bay and preserve this basic sovereignty of the individual. Okay, I think we're done with that slide for a moment. So cultural intelligence can see the upside of every one of these major worldviews or political positions, but it can also see the downsides. And that is from within the purview of any one of these political perspectives, the other perspectives appear only for their pathologies, right? So certainly the pathologies of traditionalism, of the ethnocentric viewpoint that goes with traditionalism, include racism, sexism, homophobia, authoritarian tendencies, right? There's all kinds of negatives of traditionalism, which modernity is somewhat complicit in. Modernity likewise has significant pathologies, including environmental destruction and gross income inequality and nuclear I always have a hard time saying that, nuclear weapons, right? There's all kinds of negatives. While traditionalism may have racism and bigotry, traditionalism never threatened to destroy the world or wipe out the biosphere. So modernity, even though it brings important new advances in its cultural emergence, it also brings these new pathologies that make it unsustainable, which has led in history to the emergence of progressivism. But progressivism has gained traction in cultural evolution by being outraged by modernity and traditionalism, by pushing off against, by seeing only or at least primarily, the pathologies of these previous cultural structures. So naturally, there's this spirit of rejection, this spirit of seeing modernity as something that has to be wiped away, or something that's entirely a criminal enterprise. And so again, that's healthy. It's healthy as a first step to reject the pathologies and say, no, we're not going to settle for that. We're not going to settle for a civilization that's not environmentally sustainable or has gross inequality or is leading us to potentially nuclear war. We want a more loving and caring and inclusive society. So this is a major moral breakthrough, which has helped progressivism gain ground. But like these other major political blocs or worldviews, progressivism also has negatives, which means that it's by itself is not capable of, at least I argue in greater detail in the book, progressivism is not capable of solving the problem of hyperpolarization or bringing America to a position of greater political functionality and greater social solidarity. And part of that reason is that it's not its job. Its job is to break out of the egg, is to reject the old society so that a better society can form. But because so much of the baggage of that spirit of rejection is still carried within progressivism, for example, intense anti-modernism, right? A kind of a rejection of much of the liberal values of modernity, right? Many critics of progressivism point to how illiberal it can be, or how intolerant, or how totalitarian some of its demands are. And so this sort of seeing modernity only for its negatives and not appreciating how progressive culture itself is using, how it's interdependent with the values of modernity, relies on those accomplishments and needs to affirm those. That's not happening in progressive culture. Likewise, just as it has a rejection of modernity, it also rejects many of the elements of traditionalism, including patriotism. So we could, that is the excessive jingoistic pride of patriotism is certainly something that we want to overcome. And part of the breaking out of that bubble involves saying, no, America has committed crimes and misdeeds, and we should balance that pride with a degree of shame. However, many of the strongest voices within progressivism today go only for the shame, right? They're focused on eliminating the pride by characterizing American history as, a sinister criminal enterprise, saying that any pride that you have in America is a lie, that the crimes of America are what we should be focusing on as a culture and atoning for. And while I agree that we have to atone for the crimes of America, I think that pride and shame themselves are ultimately interdependent. And ideally, we're able to moderate our shame with a degree of pride, just as we want to moderate our pride with a degree of shame. So progressivism is doing its job, but the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who first recognized that culture was evolving, that history was moving, he had a construct which has been oversimplified, but for purposes of a Zoom call like this, I can simplify it by recognizing the pattern of development as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now, sometimes there's an antithesis and that creates chaos, and there's no synthesis, and then there's a regression. And that's certainly a real possibility of our political condition. But because progressivism has emerged as the antithesis to the established culture, as an important evolutionary move, but because progressivism is not capable of reunifying the society at a higher level, right? So the next step is a synthesis. The next step is something that might be considered post-progressive, that attempts to transcend and include all of the important values of not only progressivism, but the liberal values of modernity and the traditional values of our ancient ancestors. And how such a cultural synthesis could be framed, how we could attract people to this, how we could use it as a method to solve particular political positions is the subject of the book, which I hope you'll check out. And not only is it a book you can buy, but it's much of it is explained on the two websites. So I'm not trying to sell things. I'm trying to help America overcome this problem which threatens its democracy, which is this hyperpolarization. It's a cultural problem. In a sense, we're all partially responsible for this problem. And by trying out this perspective, by investigating this idea of cultural intelligence and using it. So let me give you a couple of issue examples, and then I want to leave time for questions. In the book, I give an example of gay marriage as the use of cultural intelligence, even unconsciously, to integrate values from across the spectrum to make political progress where other issues are blocked because of hyperpolarization. So the issue of gay marriage effectively integrates the values of all four of those circles that I showed in the slide. It certainly forwards progressive values, because obviously LGBTQ equality is an important value for progressives, but it also advances liberal democratic values through basic fairness, that gay people ought to have a right to get married and share the same basic rights as everyone else in the society. It also advances what I call those liberty values of conservative modernists, because from their perspective, the government really shouldn't be in the business of saying who can be married and who can not be married, and it shouldn't be bringing into law religious ideas that ought to stay within religion. But crucially, the issue of gay marriage integrates traditional values, even though it doesn't integrate traditional interests, like I showed the bedrock layers, right? The evangelicals may oppose gay marriage still, but the basic family value of wanting to make a family commitment. You know, it was the issue of marriage, which couldn't be a more traditional issue, that ultimately persuaded large portions of people on the right that it was the moral thing to do to support gay marriage. So not only has it been made legal by the Supreme Court, but opinion polls now show that a strong majority of Americans, again, many people on the right, think that gay marriage is a good idea, and they've been persuaded by this issue, partially because it integrates these traditional values, even though it doesn't integrate those supposed interests. Another quick example is the legalization of marijuana. It integrates a lot of values on the right, like the fact that individual communities should be empowered to make their own decisions about issues like prohibition. And obviously it integrates progressive values, but part of what explains the fact that the marijuana legalization and gay marriage have made rapid political progress while all these other issues like climate change or immigration or healthcare are stuck, is that those issues have effectively integrated this variety of values. It makes them harder to object to and more politically palatable. And what we're doing now with the Institute for Cultural Evolution is developing a political platform where we're suggesting how values can be integrated in a similar way on issues like education and immigration and climate change. The idea is that we want to create a win-win-win solution at the level of values and then argue for there, so that traditionalists know that we're taking those values, their values into consideration. Progressives know that we're taking their values into consideration. This is the sort of the beginning, the meat and potatoes of this synthesis, which ultimately isn't just about political issues or political compromising. It's ultimately about developing a cultural perspective which can appreciate the interdependence of all of these cultural structures and how ultimately there is a way that they can cooperate even while they continue to challenge each other, right? We're not trying to create a kind of a mushy middle ground where it's all just relativistic and everything's the same. No, there's some situations where progressive values ought to govern the situation, and maybe some others where traditional values ought to hold sway. What we're saying is we want to be able to use the positives of all the values. We want all these values across the spectrum. We want to be able to confront and condemn the pathologies of every one of these values so that each one of these stages or structures can be in a relationship of challenge and support, so that they're acknowledging that they are interdependent even while they critique and oppose each other. So we're never going to get rid of the opposition, but we can evolve to a more inclusive and more socially friendly political position. And again, maybe we have to wait until after the election for that to happen. But this is a basic outline of the approach of developmental politics in the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And I hope I've given you at least a little taste of it. And so I want to save the rest of the time for questions and comments.